Welcome to the MBA series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to the Next Economy MBA book podcast series, episode 24. I'm Kevin Bayuk, a worker owner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined today by Aaron Axelrod, also a worker owner at Lift Economy. Feeling we should dive right into this episode where we're going to talk about transforming capitalism and the Lift story. So, Aaron, what do we mean by transforming capitalism?
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm excited to have this conversation. And we're circling back to some themes we started this series with. We have mentioned, and often in the course, we actually use the term business as usual economy as opposed to the term capitalism. By the time we get to this point in the training, we've been through 16 sessions together, and we've often unpacked through the course of those sessions a lot of shared learnings around how does capitalism or the business as usual economy show up? What are the aspects of it? What's the kind of shared analysis of this business as usual economy that can justifiably be described as racialized capitalism? So we have this sort of shared language, if you will, to really have a shared basis for understanding that all of the isms that we encounter on a daily basis, whether it be racism or sexism or heteronormative culture or ageism or ableism, all of them kind of are a product of systems that have been designed for multiple generations. And as with any systems change approach, when we talk about transforming these systems, we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of emergence in how systems change. So learning from thinkers like Donella Meadows and Adrienne Maree Brown, who talk about emergent strategy and levers for change in the system, there's emergent properties. There's not a clear-cut path that we can just follow to systems change. And so what do we mean by transforming capitalism? Frankly, we do not have the answers for that pathway to follow. There's a lot of emergence and there's lots to address. And so one of the reasons we use the business as usual, we describe it as transforming the business as usual economy, is we find sometimes when we get into using terms like capitalism, we get into long, drawn-out debates or battles around definitions of what capitalism is or is not, and we get mired in these debates as opposed to just starting at the baseline that we know that the system as it is currently manifesting is not working. It's causing tremendous harm, tremendous inequality, and recognizing that coming from that shared recognition that this current system, whatever we call it, is not working, we find we can kind of shortcut to, okay, what do we do about it? How do we work to get into shared alignment around what needs to change and try on experimenting how our activities and our interactions can lead to that systems change. And of course, it is a balance because we can't overlook the need to have that shared alignment around some of the problems. And we like to drill down into the specifics as opposed to just labeling it as capitalism or labeling it as a nomenclature that's going to get us into sort of a semantic battle. Anything to add to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's right. And for anybody who's attached to some kind of definition, capitalism is private ownership of the means of production and not by the state or communism or something like that. In this case, when we're talking about transforming capitalism, we're very much referring to what we had talked about as the business as usual economy and all of its tendencies towards exploitation. And whether that is private, oftentimes corporate ownership of the means of production and its profit motives and shareholder supremacy and the monetary policies that have emerged with that system of capital or capitalism that have an embedded growth obligation from interest-bearing debt as the form of money. All of those interlocking systems that make capitalism a force that has created this harm that you're referring to, that's what we're referring to when we say transforming. Like you said, we don't want to get stuck in the idea of, oh, Lyft is talking about transforming capitalism. Obviously, that means they're communists or heretics or some way. Definitely in culture at large, if you question capitalism there oftentimes at all and provide any critique, there's this immediate gravity to some type of slander of like, oh, well, that means you are a state socialist or a communist of some sort in some way. And clearly there's a plurality of other ways to organize and exchange goods and services to meet human needs that are neither what we know of as business as usual or racialized capitalism today, nor are they state socialism or communism, which is oftentimes put up as this false kind of scary idol that is meant to frighten people from being critical and dissenting. So, and I love what you said, Aaron, just that, you know, when we're talking about transforming capitalism, there's a humility in all of this that we don't have the answers. We don't know. We're on the pathway of discovery like all of you.
And I think we should also mention that one of the pieces of this is it's not an all or nothing thing. And so recognizing in the training, we like to talk about gradients or spectrums. It is the case that at any given point in our journey of transformation of these systems, will likely be embedded in them simultaneously. And so giving a lot of compassion and a lot of generosity to ourselves and to each other around this being a long process and long journey, and not something to be taken as an all or nothing sort of kind of purist approach of you're either in capitalism or you're out. So assuming that our listeners are on board with kind of the need to transform the business as usual economy or capitalism, how do we do that, Kevin?
And thanks, Aaron. And like we said, we don't necessarily know the answers, but the reason this question is so important for us at this point in the Next Economy MBA learning journey, or even in the book, is because you all, as listeners, might remember if you've been listening along the series, we did a critique of the business as usual economy and the gross harms for ecocide and the likely self-termination or suicide of humanity if we could continue on the path that we're on. We're blowing past planetary boundaries. We have an existential crises, a set of crises that include more than just, global climate change and global warming catastrophes. So with that case being made, in the Next Economy MBA, there's a whole set of learning sessions that are related to modifying and changing and even indeed transforming the economic institutions about how we mediate meeting our needs. So a lot of the training is trying to equip people with the nuts and bolts of like, okay, I want to, engage in economic activity. I want to provide goods and services for my community, but I don't want to fall into the traps of starting a corporation and having to scale to be some kind of multinational, or to, access venture private equity money and make more wealth for already wealthy white people, or whatever the other traps are that we've discussed along the way. And so when we make this case that in order to transform capitalism, we want to share that it's not just as easy as swapping out like corporations with co-ops and nonprofits and all the things that we've talked about. So many of the features we've talked about in this series, in the book, and in the training, it's not just a one-for-one swapping. There's a bigger picture to look at. And so in some ways, like you said, this is bringing us all the way back to the beginning. So transformative change in the context of the next economy means that just swapping out the institutions will be limited. It can create a tremendous amount of harm reduction, like you said, along the gradient. And there's lots of regenerative benefits that could be possible. Communities that have been categorically excluded from wealth building can be included in ownership of certain assets or in the wealth creation. There are ecosystems that can be restored through the process of meeting needs for food and shelter. And we've highlighted many case stories and examples along the way in this series of organizations that are literally doing that. And if all the organizations in the world, the institutions, the businesses, the enterprises that were organized to meet human needs were oriented towards those types of outcomes, it would be a much better world. There's no doubt about that. And there's an inadequacy. Many of the structures that we highlighted through case stories and throughout the series oftentimes still have vestigial mandates for hierarchies because of the legal system in which they are trying to comply with, or they have kind of some perverse incentives related to the tax system of the nation state that they are created in. Almost all the examples that we've provided, but not quite all, throughout the series are still reliant on the monetary system, currency that is created by national banks, that is created as interest-bearing debt. That money creation mechanism leads to kind of an inexorable mandate for growth and exponential growth, which leads to all of that ecocidal activity. And we've also shared along the way that there's challenges in forming and maintaining and sustaining any of these transformative or change-oriented institutions in addressing the price parity paradox, which we can talk about more as a reminder about trying to compete in this sense, not compete to win, but in compete to survive. Because the business as usual economy has manufactured demand, artificial demand for so many goods and services, and the goods and services that are delivered through capitalism, as we've pointed out, and as I'm sure all the listeners agree, create these horrible externalities and harms. And that's why the prices of goods and services are so artificially low. And to actually sustain an organization, we've talked about this paradox. So all of those are really, challenging aspects about doing the transformation. So we have to widen the aperture and look at some of the other aspects of what systems change means in order to address those challenges. Erin, anything you want to add to that piece?
Yeah, it's almost like when I ask you the question of how do we do that, this session in our MBA and also in this podcast is reminding us that it's so much more, so much beyond even the purview of the MBA training, because as you mentioned, there's transforming next economy institutions and making them as competitive with pricing and regenerative and practices for humans and for planet and all the principles that we've talked about through this training. But this session really reminds us that that's just one slice of the puzzle when we look at the systems transformation that is needed. And so one thing we talk about in this session, but we don't drill down deeply throughout the course of the MBA training, but some of our alumni and key collaborators and stakeholders are deepening into this, is the realm of government. So, Kevin, why is it that governance or government needs to change to have a transformed economy that works for everyone with no one left out?
Yeah. And so the first part for me to help understand why government needs to change is just to ask the basic questions of like, does anybody believe that the business as usual economy or capitalism has an influence on existing government systems like electoral politics? And I think one would have to be fairly willfully ignorant to not be able to acknowledge that there's been a corporate capture or influence. In fact, there's a strong motivation from the capitalism business as usual economy to leverage the use of capital through lobbying and other means of influencing the mechanisms of regulation and subsidy. And so we see these huge distortions in the United States, just looking at the Farm Bill or the subsidies for fossil fuel or the military industrial complex, just to name a few massive areas where the state, both at federal, state, even local government levels, are close bedfellows, if you will, with capitalism, with corporate interests, and the spending that is done on behalf of corporations through super PACs and what's either disclosed or not disclosed is just enormous and growing, and dwarfs the type of contributions to influence policy from individuals or the public at large. And so it's probably not an exaggeration to say that government has been the mechanisms of regulation and subsidy have largely been captured by business as usual interests. And so with that being the case, because government is not playing the role of regulating the harms and the externalities that are created through business as usual exploitation practices, the opportunity would be like, okay, well, what if government were playing that role? What if there was a mechanism to effectively make the cost of creating so much harm in the world to ecosystems and exploitation of labor and people? What if that were illegal? What if that were impossible? What if that were not okay? And there was the authority to be able to put an end to that behavior. By internalizing those costs, that would effectively address a major portion of this price parity paradox, making the behavior of actually restoring ecosystems, of treating people well, of increasing biodiversity and soil health, etc., actually more profitable. That would make more sense from an economic feasibility perspective. And that would change everything. But then we get stuck with the question of like, how do we change government? In the same way that our imagination for transforming the economy or changing economic institutions is oftentimes fairly limited because there's not great examples that are available to us, to our collective imagination. Moreover, because the system of government has so much power and influence for shaping culture today, there's a motivated reasoning for government to use whatever levers it has to make it seem like, oh, you're questioning democracy, you must be some type of totalitarian, communist or something, some enemy image branding or label, to even question the idea that the system of electoral politics is itself in need of transformation. So it becomes very difficult to talk about it. And we'll talk about it in the next session of our series in terms of what's next for the next economy. But it turns out that there's a plurality of approaches and solutions using the same framework of a gradient of things that are less bad and reducing harm of the existing system of democracy or electoral politics or government institutions, as well as there are some radically transformative efforts that truly embrace, examples like citizens' assemblies and citizens' deliberative councils, the idea that bottom-up governance to place-based or, bioregional governance is something that's not only possible. There are people working on these approaches, but it's mostly culturally invisible. So we'll definitely highlight some stuff in what's next for the next economy, because there are institutional efforts and things that we could take part in. So similar to the way government needs to change, another system that is really implicated in the perpetuation of capitalism is the education system. So Erin, why would the education system need to change?
Well, there's a lot to say here, and there certainly are places in the globe that still to this day have education systems that are embedded in family or village or community culture, where children are learning skills in place, learning skills around functionally how to participate and be a full, whole, engaged player in the functioning of meeting the needs of the community, the family, the household, that children are still learning in place and are not sent away to separate schools, or how schooling shows up popularly in much of the world now is this kind of separation. And really, this came about through the advent of Industrial Revolution, the U.S. education system as we know it today, the popular rollout of the U.S. education system, public schooling, etc., was really designed to create a compliant workforce. So, Industrial Revolution took children away from the family so adults could be sent to work. And, this, as we'll talk about, all of these systems that we sometimes think of as separate, government, education, media, they're really nested and interrelated and kind of build on one another. And so, whereas we've inherited a system where there's really big questions around what skills are our children learning that's actually able to contribute to the next 10 years of ecosystem collapse and equitably sharing our resources so that everyone can have their needs met. We have sedentarism as a massive problem in schools, children, not moving their body, which contributes further down the line to really adverse health outcomes and chronic disease, which is on track to bankrupt our country. And so all of these factors contribute to a context where education, as we know it commonly, is actually compromising a lot of our ability to train up effective players in a changing world and a changing climate. And so when we talk about transforming an education system, we often go back to some of those principles similar to the principles of transforming next economy institutions. Are education institutions democratic? Are they cooperative? Are they community owned? Do kids have a say in actually what's relevant to their lives to learn? Are they self-directed and project-based? Do they create interest and foster excitement and engagement in students as opposed to creating boredom and disillusionment and disengagement and lack of mental wellness and health? And are they thinking about the total human development? Are we thinking about children as, these whole ecosystems in and of themselves, where it's not just the brain that needs to be nurtured, it's the body and the emotional body and the spiritual self? And are they fundamentally pluralistic, right? Because when we think about just a kind of top-down prescribed education system that has many, many roots in industrialization and creating a compliant workforce, that carries with it a specific worldview that is not multicultural, it's not multilingual, it's not multi-perspective. And so to transform the education system, we need to embrace those pluralities and those diverse worldviews. What would you add to that, Kevin?
I think you nailed everything that I would have shared. And the thing that comes up for me is like an emotional reaction. Like, what if there was a world where we had that transformed education system? I've met lots of like PhDs and people with master's degree in computer science or something like that. But tragically, most of them don't know where their water comes from, don't know how their body works, don't know how the food system works, don't know, how to repair and maintain the shelter that they live in, don't have access to many of the insights that would animate their imagination of what could be possible, both historically and currently, about what's going on in the world for alternative ways for humans to meet their needs. That saddens me, because just what if the education system was functioning in such a way where that knowledge was the commonwealth, common knowledge amongst all people. And to think that not only do many of the people that I meet in my day-to-day life not know those things, moreover, there's something like $1 trillion bubble of spending on higher education, which has created education on other things, which reify and maintain the exploitation economy, which is ecocidal and ultimately suicidal. And so that's so disappointing, but such a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up things like food, water, shelter, because one could very easily write those off as being overly pedantic, and well, there's higher minded things to think about. But the irony or the tragedy is that you could absolutely get a PhD in physics could encompass learning about all those life support systems, solar oven creation. There's so many ways that you could stack in that kind of cerebral academic discipline while doing both. And that's, I think, what we're talking and touching on is how do we stack in more of the critical skills for just being a living body, a living human on the planet, weave them more deeply into the education as opposed to creating these silos and fractures. So we also want to talk about, Kevin, this very, very influential system called media. Why does media need to change?
It's a great question. And when it's positioning media right after education and in our dialogue here, for me, it obviously brings up these, like, where do we draw our lines of distinction? And without getting like sucked into like academic semantic distinctions that may or may not be important, but like, when is media actually a form of propaganda that is actually educating society? And there's so much within media. There's both entertainment media, but then there's like, quote unquote, the news or journalism. And again, we see this huge subsuming force of capitalism and the business as usual economy, both in the way it's captured government and higher education. It's also, like, self-evidently, I believe, captured media and the systems of media that are available to at least people in the affluent world and maybe all over the world, increasingly so. And so what somebody learns about through the news or is exposed to through the news, whatever that means, is subject to an agenda that is a corporate-driven agenda, because the funding, financing, the means of producing most of the news is driven by the economic interest. And so what drives economic interest? Well, the perpetuation of the system of capitalism. And so all the things that if we did know about, they were reported, if there were knowledge of, that would change our behavior, that would change the possibilities for any community, for any society, are not exposed. Moreover, most of what is, purported to be journalism is caught in this trap that Noam Chomsky and so many others have written about for so long, of that we get stuck in this divisive warfare, because that animates our limbic, response, our emotional response. So sensationalized news, things that get us angry and put us into us-them dynamics, whereas many of us might actually share a lot of values and care about our place and where we live and have a lot of alignment. There might be a lot of popular alignment as Homo sapiens to want to survive, but we're distracted from even exploring those possibilities because of what's presented through what grabs our attention. And what grabs our attention is what the corporate capture of media is intended to do, capture your attention, and that happens to be things that create more division, divisiveness, and distraction. There's other aspects of the media system that I think would be important to change, but the same themes that you mentioned, Aaron, from an institutional transformation perspective for education apply in media. And in the next session, What's Next for the Next Economy, will highlight some of what's happening there, but in terms of democratizing the agenda of media so that the public can actually have some say in what is researched and reported, having the institutions that generate media be community owned or multi-stakeholder owned. And so from ownership and governance and general orientation, there's definitely a world where there's a more democratic, pluralistic media system that is oriented towards change. As a side note, there was like a documentary so long ago, I think it was called Green Plans. It's about Huey Long. I can't remember who was featured in it, but what I remember about it was something from the 80s. Sorry for this tangent, but like there was this effort in Denmark, I believe it was, to use nationalized or public television which was at the time, some of the more accessible forms of media, to share messaging related to bicycling and, waste management and kind of behavior change. And what I remember from that documentary, and I haven't independently tried to verify all the claims, but the assertions were that this led to enormous outcomes in the general behavior of the public in terms of reducing automobile use and some other behaviors, because it was presented in such a way to, again, animate our imagination of what's possible. And I just have this dream of like, what would a media system look like that was oriented towards a truly livable future? We haven't even really scratched the surface, and we have no idea what kind of outcomes would be possible if we were to do that. Aaron, what am I missing? What would you add on the media piece?
I mean, there's so much more other systems to talk about. I think I'm just inspired next time to get into talking about the alternatives to the media that we're tracking and how people are actually grappling with and creating systems change. But yeah, we could go on for days about about the problems.
Any one of these, right? So here's a big one. The biggest asset in the business as usual economy is land, of course. Most of it's stolen and so forth. So Aaron, why does land ownership and tenure, why do the systems of private property need to change? What about land?
Oh, well, you mentioned the very first reckoning is that we live in an economy that the wealth of which is built on the history of the legacy of stolen land and stolen labor. So when we hear people talking about Bill Gates is buying up American farmland to be able to, implement regenerative practices or whatever the next, the media, however the media frames it, we have to question this pattern of consolidation of wealth through hoarding land. And that is systemically happening to this day. And the legacies of that theft of land is that whites account for 96% of all private landowners in the US, which obviously is not representative of an equitable distribution of resources. It's hugely problematic. And when you look at that statistic, you cannot ignore that legacy of that initial theft of land still to this day creates horrific outcomes in terms of who has agency and decision-making and access to the means of production. And so, alongside that, we're in a moment where we're in the midst of one of the biggest kind of turnover of farmland. 400 million acres of US land is changing hands right now as thousands of farmers and ranchers retire. Yet next generation farmers, particularly women, young farmers, farmers of color, are really struggling to get access to that land, because we know that in the way capital is formed in the capital system, folks with already existing access to capital are more poised to be able to grow their wealth through acquiring land or making a real estate investment. So this whole system of speculation on land, the fact that every time a piece of land gets sold, that transaction creates wealth out of thin air, essentially. So this speculation on land, we're starting from a very unequal place, rooted in legacies of theft and the horrors of attempted genocide in this country. And then we're starting from that unequal place, and we're just making it more and more unequal because the people most poised to buy more land already have capital accumulation. So how do we transform the notion of property or ownership and move towards ways to completely redefine how land is accessed in this country? Even the system of the governmental ownership of land prohibits indigenous communities from stewarding and bringing regenerative practices to lands that need it, because even indigenous communities don't have access to the public lands because of the way they're stewarded by the government. So yeah, there's so many, we're not going to talk about the solutions in this session, but the idea that the whole construct of I own this land and my future generations are going to inherit it, I believe needs to be completely transformed and abolished if we're going to actually have an equitable way to repair the harms and the legacies of land tenure. And it's not just in farmland, it's not just in open space, it's in housing and how people access the fundamental need for shelter in cities and in counties and in rural areas, redefining all of those notions of property ownership. All right, well, let's take it home with culture. What do we mean when we say culture has to change, Kevin?
I think it's exactly the combination of all those things. Is right now there are these cultural almost addictions or norms that, like you're saying, land. There's so few people I meet who are like, my dream is to steward land that remains forever in the commons to be governed by the indigenous peoples, the First Nations peoples that it was taken from, that covenants could be addressed for, stewardship rights to access it, and that my children and their children would also be bound to those covenants to be good stewards of land in partnership with those who it was stolen from. That's just not the American dream as people understand it. So there's cultural addictions to like owning property, owning a home, passing down property to future generations. There's cultural addictions to distractive media and different forms of both entertainment or news presented as entertainment. There's when there's what's normal in school. Oh, get a good degree. Go to school, do well, test well, measure well against others, and then go get a higher education degree to get a good job, to make lots of money, to save money, to retire. There's also an addiction to like when somebody says something like, oh, well, I don't believe that the United States should exist or that the state of California should exist, that there should be a federated set of bioregions around the world that have some type of shared governance that's more responsive to the needs of people in life. That type of addiction to the memes of patriotism or identity in groups and out groups. There's so many aspects of culture as a whole that actually would need to shift and transform in order to actually transform capitalism. So even by just addressing the institutions or these other systems, the whole notion of like what are our desires and aspirations as a culture, our priorities, those also need to change. And that's some of the things that we talked about earlier in another session where we talk about next economy living. But all the things that we just talked about kind of connect into there. And I know all of this can sound like completely overwhelming for some listeners. And so does this all seem overwhelming and hopeless? Or how would you respond if somebody were to ask you that?
Well, it's helpful to remember that because all of the above interrelate with one another and affect each other, the overwhelm really stems out of how inseparable each of these systems are. I find solace in that, in recognizing that there is an aspect of when we change one system that contributes to helping to change the others, and they build on one another. Similarly, I also find solace in sort of this kind of liberatory vantage point of, oh, wow, there's so much that needs to change, that something that gives me hope is that it's easier to imagine something completely different when we recognize how much needs to change. So there can be an aspect that brings it into a more hopeful space of not being bound or beholden to old patterns that are no longer serving us. So I think certainly there's overwhelm, and certainly there's hope in recognizing that one can affect a change in another area of the systems, and they interact in potentially generative ways as well, in that one solution around land rematriation can also touch on cultural change and educational change system. We know lots of projects that are rematriating land in order to facilitate alternative education systems, as just one example. And so recognizing, though, that there is no one silver bullet solution or approach, and that we don't know the answers to what is going to all the pluralities that are going to be the examples of transformation. What are some of the things that we can do, Kevin?
I love the example you were just sharing, Erin, because I think the theme that I would say of what we can do throughout this series, throughout the book, and throughout the Next Economy MBA training, we talk about kind of ways to stack functions, to do multiple things through one set of actions. And one of the richest set of stacked functions comes from what we've described before as next economy living. It's really kind of a no regrets strategy. If you are able to, which we've acknowledged before, there's definitely differences of privilege and positionality in order to take some of the steps that we tend to associate with next economy living. But at its heart, next economy living is kind of weaning ourselves off of the cultural norms and the cultural dependence as a consumer that relies on these extended supply chains that are creating so much harm in the world. The more we move from a consumer culture to a producer culture, and the more we explore connecting with community as a way to mediate meeting our needs rather than by the cash economy to meet our needs. There's so many stacked benefits in all that activity. It's not just that you're becoming more resilient as an individual or family. It's also the case that a common outcome from next economy living is more time affluence because your needs like housing and food or whatever are less dependent upon generating a cash income, that you actually have more time to contribute to doing work that is transformative, or you have more time to contribute to your community in terms of volunteerism or transformation or change or facilitating change. So it's not uncommon to see greater quality of life, increased wellness, increased mental health, as well as more work being done on transformation itself. So next economy living is something that all of us can start with a next step, whatever that is. So that's where do I start with all this overwhelm? Well, there is a next step for each of us, no matter what our privilege or positionality. And that's like self-work. But it's also true that a lot of the things we talked about with institutional change through most of the training also have kind of second order effects that we can talk about. Like there was the principle of more democratic and inclusive governance systems within a co-op or a nonprofit, a worker self-directed nonprofit. The practice of democracy on a day-to-day basis in your vocational setting, what we've noticed in our work is that it has this second order effect of that the people who get practice and being able to collaborate with others tend to be better collaborators in their family or in their neighborhood or in their municipal governance or in their region. And so there's an upskilling that happens that has these spillover effects to address the governance system. Or we mentioned one of our principles, embedding education into the goods or services. Well, that's also connected to transforming the education system. So here's this big system. Let's transform the education system. It's a big, gnarly problem. Well, a lot of the effort that people are doing in terms of following the next economy principles to express them through alternative next economy institutions, it's actually feeding the change of those other systems. We talk about principle 9, I believe, the systems change principle of working on advocating for policy change and government change or governance change, the same way that business as usual businesses get together and have a chamber of commerce that creates perverse influence on government to create, reduced regulation and increased subsidy of bad practices. The same thing can happen with gathering and organizing power amongst next economy organizations to actually start to reduce the harm and then ultimately to lead to to influence regulation and subsidy to actually support regenerative, reparative models of economy. And so all of the things that we talked about before have the potential for stacking functions. And so I guess in general, we would advocate for there's good places to start doing work, both in our own lives and in the transformation work that we do in next economy institutions that don't have to ignore these other aspects of the society that keep us trapped in business as usual racialized capitalism. Aaron, anything to add, or do you want to also talk about how Lift Economy is part of this in terms of our definitely inadequate, and definitely not having all the answers in terms of our approach to, working on these big systems change issues?
Yeah, I think just to help. This has been a pretty cerebral conversation. I do just want to honor that and bring our listeners into like a body check and like deep breathe, take a breath, feel your feet on the ground, maybe tune into some of the more than human sounds outside you, if there's bird song around you or if there's wind blowing through the trees, and just to go into a little bit of, how does this apply at Lyft? How are we kind of showing up in our own endeavors to embody some of this transformation? And, most of our listeners know that like one of the core offerings that Lyft Economy has is this sort of direct support or technical assistance that we do with companies and next economy organizations. And, we do that both with sort of how we frame it up in our training, both like midwifery organizations, those organizations really at the helm of bringing to birth a completely new way of new and old ways of bringing forward products or services to the market and in meeting human needs. And then sort of the companies that work in really, really hard within sectors to what we call hospice out, or help as compassionately and humanely as possible, help these business as usual systems to die, to dissolve, to compost, to be composted into something else. And so that technical assistance can look a lot of different ways. It can look through supporting midwifery efforts to, continue do radical things like self-set salaries and worker ownership, and it can help guide hospice organizations to think about more, integrations of multi-stakeholder ownership or open book management, or developing new goods and services that have more regenerative outcomes, open sourcing critical innovations, all of these things that we talk about in the training. And so we do that at Lyft Economy as our consulting practice. And we know that our handful of worker owners and employees are not enough. So growing the community, that's where the Next Economy MBA comes in. This now 500 strong alumni network of so many visionary entrepreneurs that are also doing their own consulting practices, or are they themselves working deeply in these integrated solutions and helping ensure that these solutions are built and sustained and grow and are shared and are implementing the principles of the training. are doing movement building in their work, are creating communities of practice. So the MBA community is so foundational to this work of creating the next economy. Another aspect of our work has been around this realm of capital formation. So we know that current ways of capital access are very problematic, and most of the, certainly most of venture capital goes to white male-led entities and organizations. And so, but even this notion that venture capital is the only way to capitalize a business can be problematic as well. And so helping support more cultural adoption of and understanding of the range of different ways to access capital to grow one's business, whether that be community capital, philanthropic, non-extractive loan funds. And in 2016, we started a fund called the Force for Good Fund. And we worked with a nonprofit partner, Community Ventures, and Jenny Casson to create that loan fund, and invested in 13 women-led and person of color-led social enterprises. And so really this work of helping to both, manifest examples of alternative capital provision to these next economy organizations, and also engaging in conversations and dialogues and networks of folks that are reimagining ways that we can deliver capital. And there's so many partners that I can't even mention just one that we've worked with and that are at the forefront of doing that work. So we also work in the realm of strategy for philanthropy and individuals who might be making impact investments. So a subsection of our clientele might be a small family foundation, helping them deploy capital and get money out the door in new ways, in ways that are more democratic, more supportive to frontline communities and communities that really need that money. Sharing the stories. This podcast is an example of us reclaiming some of that media space to share the stories of what could be different, what other possibilities there are. Sharing ideas through our interface with books, book publishing. We've got the Next Economy MBA now as a book out there. We also have self-studies. So for those folks that might not be, the MBA training itself might not be as accessible, and your learning style is a bit more to be going through material on your own pace, or even as an adjunct, an addition to the MBA, we have these self-studies. Our first one is how to raise mission-aligned capital. And then here's the realms that just keep me going and get me out of bed every day, is the realm of field building, where we've done specific research and movement building around particular areas. So a few of the areas that we've picked are these integrated, holistic, topical areas that encompass multiple aspects of the economy. So one would be building resilient communities, where we've convened stakeholder groups to come together and look at what's the nexus between regenerative agriculture and wildfire preparedness and resilience in California, and workforce development and commons-owned microgrids, as one example of one manifestation of this field building of building resilient communities. Similarly, we've done work in restorative ocean economies and really looking at the space of restorative ocean farming and how we can loft and build up a movement of stakeholders invested in regenerative ways to restore ocean ecosystem health while meeting human needs and ecosystem restoration needs. And then a couple last areas are our work with next economy infrastructure. So an example of that would be the Next Egg, where one of the insights has around the persistence of the control of these cultural business as usual aspects is very much demonstrated in retirement and how retirement shows up in our lives. And so we founded a project called the Next Egg in 2019 with a mission to help move and mobilize some of the $35 trillion in US retirement savings that right now is just propping up business as usual economy by and large, supporting oil and gas extraction and speculative real estate market and logging and a lot of harms. How do we move that capital to use some of those retirement assets to fund community-based solutions? And we have other projects going around infrastructure that includes home, how we provision shelter, food, how we grow and provision food for businesses and communities, and then healthcare as well. Next Economy Living, we've talked about a lot in this podcast, and that's a new offering of Lift Economies that we have a series of workshops coming up. And then culture offerings. So this really is spearheaded by Phoenix Soleil, partner, worker, owner, who really specializes in the human systems of how do we transform the ways that we relate to one another. And fundamentally, if we're not transforming the ways that we're relating to one another, we are failing at transforming the economy. And so these are just such an exciting series of offerings to help support people with the really critical skills and tools and resources to transform culture in everything we do. So that's just a whirlwind overview, and can't wait to hear comments and responses and what our listeners might be interested to hear more about in terms of those different pillars that Lyft works on to transform our economic systems. And yeah, Kevin, anything to add before we close?
Just that part of this work that we're trying to do is to engage in coalitions and partnerships for more movement building. So at Lyft Economy, even though we're a small worker-owned cooperative, doing a lot of things, as Aaron highlighted, all the different things that we're trying to participate in, we're also forming alliances and partnerships with other organizations who are similarly working at a systems change perspective in terms of transforming capitalism. So that would be, the Well-Being Alliance, We All, the Post-Growth Institute, the New Economy Coalition, Climate Justice Alliance, the U.S. Federation for Worker Cooperatives, Zebras Unite, the American Sustainable Business Network, just to name a few of the organizations that the Donut Economics Action Lab. There's a number of organizations that we have been developing relationships with because part of this effort needs to be federated and connected. And Lyft Economy is certainly not alone in looking at the whole system of interactions that need to change. And so this requires a movement, something akin to like what is oftentimes described in like the 1960s as like a cultural revolution or evolution. Something like that needs to happen globally in order to actually transform capitalism. And I know that sounds like a lot, but it's been our observation that it actually is happening right now. It's just mostly culturally invisible. And you could be part of it in your day-to-day life and in your vocational calling. So you're invited. And next time, for the next session, Aaron and I will be together again to talk about what's next for the next economy. And we'll hopefully animate a lot of these themes that we talked today with examples of organizations and efforts and initiatives that are absolutely doing the work to transform aspects of each of these, interrelated, nested systems that reify and hold up this capitalism, this business as usual economy. Aaron, any last words for this episode?
I would just say I'd encourage our listeners to get out on a walk and introduce yourself to someone new in your neighborhood and think about, what are aspects of this podcast that make you come alive, that you feel compelled to interface with in this work of transformation, and in doing so in a way that can nourish our bodies, our whole selves. And thank you so much for joining me on this conversation, Kevin, and sharing so much knowledge. And I hope it's useful and supportive for our listeners and their lives and their own journey to how to engage with this.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks all.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lyft Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.